All right, welcome to our brief discussion of the global division of labor, and the slides were designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture. I am, of course, Ms. Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture today. First thing you need to know is that when we talk about the global division of labor, what we're really looking at is how the process of manufacturing is split across different regions and how different areas specialize in different stages of the manufacturing process. Okay, so in general, activities that require a lot of labor are concentrated in the global economic periphery and semi-periphery in order to take advantage of lower labor costs. And whereas research and development type of activities and anything that's more information-based tends to take place more in the global core. The reasons for that are simple. Even in the global core, even the kids have relatively high levels of education. Think about it. Even as ninth graders, you have more education than most people in a lot of areas of the world. Okay, education makes workers expensive. Whereas in areas where there's not so much education, where there's a lot more people, labor costs are a lot lower. Okay, but the advantage to education is that what it does is that it makes you better able to do those research and development type tasks. Think about that a little bit the next time we ask you to do some research, or you need to, a teacher asks you to develop an idea or things like that, that really what they're doing is training you for the workforce, right? Part of the trick, part of what makes the global division of labor work is an idea called time-space compression, and it's originally put forth by a guy named David Harvey. You don't need to know his name, you do need to know the idea of time-space compression. Okay, and time-space compression is kind of the opposite of friction of distance. Okay, friction of distance is just the increasing cost and time it takes to move items from one place to another. With the advent of the internet age and modern forms of transportation, time and space matter significantly less than they used to. Okay, so it's, 100 years ago, if I wanted to talk to my mom up in Alaska, I wrote a letter and it took probably a month to get there, right? 3 weeks or a month or something like that for it to get up there. These days, if I want to talk to my mom in Alaska, I grab my cell phone and we're on the phone in no time. Right? Time matters less. Distance matters less. And what this translates to when we're talking about the global division of labor is this idea of just-in-time delivery. Okay? What it means is that instead of a company needing to keep 600 widgets on hand for the next 600 versions of what it's making, if it knows that over the next week it's only going to make 200 of, I don't know, we'll say airplanes, right? Then it only needs to keep 200 widgets. And then by the time the end of that 2 weeks rolls around, another order for 200 widgets will have come in that will keep it for the next 2 weeks. Right? So literally companies are able to keep just what they need for short-term production, and then new parts are shipped quickly when needed. And this relates back to that idea of the life cycle of a product and the changes that occur, right? And so what it does is it enables changes to occur very quickly if companies don't need to run down a large stock of part of the process. Okay. Along with this idea is the idea that production sites become significantly less important, right? Location's always a consideration when you're talking about where to build a factory or any kind of a production site. Of course, you want it near certain key ideas, right? You want it, as Alfred Weber would say, you want it near other factories that do the same thing. You want to make sure you're where the lower labor costs are, right? You want to make sure you're minimizing your transportation costs. But with just-in-time delivery, location becomes increasingly less important because you can minimize your transportation costs to next to nothing, comparatively, right? Very, very little. And so then you're looking at your labor costs, you go where your labor costs are the lowest, and a bunch of companies follow suit, right? And that builds up the agglomeration effect. And so what we end up seeing happening, and we saw this here in the U.S. in particular, like right after the North American Free Trade Agreement was passed, is that a lot of things got outsourced. And outsourced is really a fancy way of saying they moved parts of the production process out of the country. Okay, the definition on the screen says moved offshore, but offshore really means out of the country. Right. So, for instance, a bunch of manufacturers moved to maquiladora factories right along the Mexico-U.S. border because they could be just over the border and get the cheaper labor costs and fewer environmental regulations that went with being in Mexico, but still be close to their U.S. markets and close enough to fairly well minimize transportation costs, right? So location in terms of close to the market or things like that was a consideration, but it became much less of one and something that was easily overcome as soon as they were able to drop labor costs so much. Okay, so when we talk about commodity chains, right, really a commodity chain is just a series of steps a product goes through from the time it's a twinkle in its inventor's eye, as my mother would say, to the time it reaches the market and you purchase it. Okay, so if we take a look, for instance, at an iPod processor, right, and the processor is the chip that tells your iPod which songs to play and lets you sort them out and lets the iPod find them and all that stuff. We've got our basic chip design, right, and that occurs really probably looks like in the UK somewhere. Then we've got chip modifications, and those occur mostly in the US, right, along with the firmware design and the coding. Okay, and that occurs in 3 different locations in Washington State here, right, somewhere up by Kirkland, in San Jose, California, but then also halfway around the world in Hyderabad, India, which it occurs there in part so that you can take advantage of basically a 24-hour workday, but also because programmers in Hyderabad are significantly cheaper than programmers in Kirkland or in San Jose. Then once they've got the coding figured out, and they've got the firmware design, then they go through and they fabricate it. Fabricate is a fancy word for make. And that occurs mostly in China, a little bit in Taiwan, and it gets packaged and tested in Taiwan and Korea. Right, shipped to a warehouse in Hong Kong, where it's held until it's needed for assembly, which occurs in China. And then, and only then, once the iPod's been assembled, is it shipped back over to the US for you to go to Best Buy or Target or Fred Meyer's or someplace like that and buy it. Right? And in each one of those steps, that affects the local economy in a different way, okay, and has different impacts. And each one of those steps has different value added to it, right? So those, the chip design, right, the modifications, the coding, those are very valuable steps. The making, packaging, warehousing the chip, those are not so valuable. The assembly, definitely, it adds a lot of value, but it doesn't add value until you go to buy it. Okay, so each one of those steps affects different places in different ways. And so when you're looking at an iPod, you could really ask yourself, is it really made in America? Or did it just get designed in America? Did it get thought about in America, right? And did the ideas come from America and the rest, the actual made part, happened somewhere else? It's always a good question to think about when you're looking at products and things like that. So some of the major influences, we talk about the geography of manufacturing, modern geography. First thing we got to look at are transportation. Okay, and transportation is important because there's a lot of different ways to send things from one area to another, and which method you choose depends on A, how quickly do you need it to get there, B, how much money are you willing to pay, and then ultimately C, what route do you want to take. So what we end up seeing are these intermodal, what are called intermodal connections, right? Places where 2 or more modes of transportation meet in order to ease the flow of goods and reduce the cost of transportation. And this is also places where, for instance, like at the Port of Seattle, when they load the containers off the ships and onto the trucks, right? That's an intermodal connection. Okay. You also need to look at regulatory circumstances. And so increasingly in the world, what we're seeing is the development of regional trade organizations, right? Like the North American Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., which significantly reduced, actually to zero, basically, restrictions on imports between the three countries. And also like the EU with the free market. And those influence where imported goods are produced. Okay? Because it can become significantly cheaper if you're not having to pay import taxes on things, right? It also means that there's certain environmental conditions that may need to be met, right? So Europe not only has the common market where they can trade across borders without tariffs and things, and there's common labor market, but there's also common environmental rules that everybody agrees to adhere to, and there's a certain set standard for things that are imported into the European Union, what environmental regulations they want you to meet and the like. And that all takes money, it takes time to comply with, right? And so those regional trade organizations can facilitate that because what they do is they cover much larger areas. And what it does is it starts to break down trade. They try this on a worldwide level with the World Trade Organization, but it's hard to get 200 countries to agree to almost anything, much less a whole bunch of trade regulations. So that is varying degrees of successful. The other thing you have to look at when talking about contemporary manufacturing is the role of energy and the ability to get the energy that you need, right? And the role of energy as a supply factor in industrial location decisions has really kind of changed over time. Energy in the U.S. is ubiquitous. It's not a factor in industrial location here. Everybody can get the energy they need anywhere in the country. If we're manufacturing somewhere in a less developed country, though, energy becomes very much a factor. Because if you can only guaranteedly rely on 4 hours a day of energy from the grid, then you better make sure you've got generators and things like that, or solar cells or something to generate the additional energy you need. Right? So energy, as energies become more readily available in the more developed world, it's much less of a factor in industrial location, whereas in the less developed world, it becomes much more of a factor when we're talking about industrial location, along with what types of energy and things like that. So, this has been our lecture talk about the global division of labor. We talked about what is it, what are some of the impacts of it, right, and where we see which types of labor. So if it's resource and development based, R&D, that's the more developed world. If it's more labor intensive, it's going to happen in the less developed world. And then to kind of show you how that played out, we looked at the example of the iPod processor. Right, and we saw where really most of the thinking work was done in Britain and the U.S. The actual manufacturing work was done in Asia, and then a little bit of the thinking work done in India, right, in an island of development in Hyderabad. And then we looped back and we talked a little bit about some of the more contemporary issues facing manufacturing and what those mean. So if you have questions for me, I'd be delighted to hear them. Please just bring them into class and ask them, and I will do what I can, and I'll see you the next time we meet.